Hi, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about historical trends we've seen in sequencing in games and some other notes as well. Now, this is mostly about the tabletop, but it applies to video games too. Video games, especially video war games, tend to be board games put into a computer. There are differences, but there's a lot of similarities. So this series is about historical trends I've seen in more than 60 years of gaming. Do I have proof in the sense of scientific studies? No, but then most people recognize that many, if not most, scientific studies are proved wrong sooner or later. So, of course I don't have that kind of proof. Such studies don't exist. This is my own observations. That doesn't mean they're wrong. When I read something like, and this is an actual quote, "Board game design has made incredible strides in the past couple decades," I have to laugh. It's changed, yes. It's catered to a much different audience, yes. It's abandoned highly interactive games, yes. Has it made incredible strides? No. Let's start with number of players. Two-player games were common in the 60s hobby gamedom. And if you think about it, most serious classic board games are for two. Now, family and party games have always been for more than two for obvious reasons. But those aren't regarded as hobby games. Now, today, 3 to 4 players is very common in Euro-style hobby games. One player is still the most common in video games and gaining popularity on the tabletop. 3 to 4 is good for game clubs and meetings, although it's even better if the game can go up to 5 or 6. 5 or 6 happens in Euro-style games with an expansion frequently. Sequencing is a big part of game design, and that's what I'm going to focus on mostly here. Who plays when? What happens when? That's sequencing. There's a big difference between 1 and 2-player games and multiplayer games. We're going to mostly talk about 2-player games. What does the non-active player do? Nothing? Are there reactions like attacks of opportunity? Are we alternating moves of a single piece or group? Are we moving simultaneously? And so forth. There are a lot of questions here. So let's start with classic non-commercial games. Chess, checkers, Go. In all those games, you move or instead place one piece at a time. Movement is also attack. They're not separate, and attacks always succeed. If the chess piece moves into another chess piece's location, the latter is gone, is captured. Race games were different, like Pachisi and backgammon. Of course, backgammon's not ancient, it's much more recent. You still ordinarily moved 1 or 2 pieces only. In early conflict games, the mover always won the combat. Go more or less accepted, but you wouldn't put a piece down usually in Go unless you expected to gain something from it. And of course, in some of those games, there wasn't destructive combat. There's only blocking in tic-tac-toe and all of its variants, Nine Men's Morris. There's no destructive combat in backgammon and similar games. And we'll deviate out here into card games briefly. It's much easier to make them for more than 2 players, multiplayer. And the natural sequence is draw a card, then play a card or cards. Though you get a faster game if the sequence is play a card first and then draw, because the player can think about his or her next turn while the others are playing. If the player draws first to start, then they have to rethink everything in light of the new card. In my experience, play then draw means some people forget to draw. And of course, in general, some people won't think about what to do during their downtime. They'll wait until it's their turn to think. And so if they have to draw another card at that point, that's no big deal. And we can digress a little bit more and say that tiles and dominoes are really just more durable cards that frequently don't fit in the hand. Now, dominoes have numbers on them, though not like standard cards. And more recent tiles may have pictures like in Carcassonne and so on. So now we get to proprietary commercial games. Let's consider commercial games of the past 100+ years. That is, games published exclusively by one company to be sold to consumers, usually through retail shops. And prominent here is L'Attaque, and I may be butchering that pronunciation, it's French, and Stratego. Post-World War II, Stratego is an offshoot, almost an exact copy, of a 1909 game called L'Attaque, which was published in Great Britain. I don't know if it was published in France. It was patented in France. That's one of the oldest commercial war games. Each side has 36 or 40 pieces with hidden identity and strength, and you play on a board of fewer than 100 locations. In other words, there's high piece density, it's crowded, you get in your own way. Attack is still part of movement, but there's a strength comparison. The defender can win. Nonetheless, each player moves one piece in a turn. Then we jump to Conflict and Broadsides. Conflict was a dice-dominant game for up to 4 players. The dice were used for movement, though, not for combat. Movement and combat still combined, and the attacker always won. The trick was to move far enough to get to the target. When you rolled doubles, you rolled again, so you kind of waited until you rolled doubles. Broadsides, if I remember correctly, was back to the move one piece at a time with movement and combat combined. Deterministic combat. But the combat didn't destroy a ship necessarily. It would remove one mast until there were no masts left. There was some hidden information which was unusual in board games up to that time. Very unusual. Then we can talk about multiplayer games, that is, games for more than 2, Risk and Diplomacy primarily. Conflict did play up to 4, but it was a different sort of game. The movement combat one piece at a time method works less well with games where there are more than 2 sides. Diplomacy uses simultaneous movement and deterministic combat with action at a distance, the support command. And it's unusual because it's a zero-sum game, that is, you can only gain something by taking it away from someone else. So diplomacy went to the other extreme of move one piece at a time to having everybody move at once. Risk lets a player do all of his movement and then attacking at once. And I don't recall offhand whether you move them all and then attack, or you move and attack and then you can move somebody else who hasn't moved yet. In diplomacy and conflict, combat is still about maneuver, and the attacker never loses, although the attacker may fail to gain in diplomacy. In Risk, combat is about the dice, and the attacker can lose. That's a big contrast. Games about war almost always include maneuver in combat, but originally the maneuver resulted in a deterministic combat which the attacker always won, and that's no longer true. How much one or the other is emphasized makes a big difference in how the game plays. Many games nowadays are mostly about combat. Games that are mostly about maneuver are much less common. Now we get to Avalon Hill war games. In those games, all units of a side could move during the turn. This was followed by combat, so combat was separate from movement. Something like Risk, which was issued about the same time, occurred in Tactics, which is the original Avalon Hill game, both from 1959, I think. The attacker can lose a combat in Avalon Hill games just as they can in Risk. It's dependent combat, however. One die roll results in losses to either or both sides. The defender can retreat after combat, which is also true for diplomacy, but not, if I recall correctly, for Risk. Soaking off is prominent in Avalon Hill games. A weak attack could tie up many enemies, sacrificing your weak piece while you combine with a strong attack on the remaining opposition. What made the Avalon Hill games work with dependent combat is that there was a combat table. And that is a change from earlier games. Now, combat tables nowadays are very much frowned upon because people don't want to look at tables, or most people. But at that time, it was not a problem. It was not regarded as a problem. Now, to briefly talk about dependent versus independent combat. Dependent combat depends on what the attacker does. The defender does nothing during combat. Independent combat sees both sides doing something. So Risk is independent combat. Both sides roll the dice. Britannia is another example. Both sides roll the dice. Early Avalon Hill games with the combat results table, only the attacker rolled a single die. Stratego is dependent. Only the attacker moves. Chess is dependent. Independent combat is relatively new. Is it better? Well, it depends on what you're doing. What about Axis and Allies and similar games like that? They use the Avalon Hill style of moving everyone and then fighting. But it's independent rather than dependent, so both sides roll dice, and a lot of dice. There's also a departure for when combat is separate. The defenders cannot retreat. They must fight to the death. It's an odd thing from a realism point of view, but I can understand why it might be necessary from a game point of view. And we'll talk much more about things in part 2. Thanks for listening.